It's time now for our news review segments where we take a look at one of our stories in a little bit more detail. The European Council has called on EU leaders to speed up talks on use of confiscated Russian assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine. President Charles Michel says the profits from the frozen assets could be used for reconstruction efforts. Michel described the proposal as a question of justice. The EU has blocked 300 billion euros of assets belonging to the Russian Central Bank back in November. The move is part of the sanctions the bloc imposed on Russia over the war in Ukraine. Moscow has hit back with its own measures, including limitations to the supply of energy to Europe. Joining us on this edition of the program is Harley Schlanger, spokesman for the LaRouche organization from Potsdam, Germany. And we also have Greg Simons, a researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies from Sweden. Gentlemen, welcome. And Harley, if I could start with you, does the EU have the right to use these frozen Russian assets for the reconstruction of Ukraine?
This is an act of ultimate hypocrisy. The so-called rules-based order is stealing money. That's what this sanction policy represents. They've stolen the assets that Russia deposited in Western banks, and now they're saying they're going to use it for reconstruction of Ukraine. What they should do is stop sending weapons to Ukraine and let negotiations take place. But this idea that somehow they're going to starve Russia, they're going to force Russia to go to leave Ukraine and leave the special military operation unfulfilled, it's not going to happen. So what NATO and the European Union are doing is trying to extend the war as a way of weakening and defeating Russia.
Right, so Greg, we hear from Russian officials that Western weapons, as Harley was alluding to, are being shipped to the war zone, are only prolonging the conflicts, prolonging the suffering, prolonging the destruction of Ukraine. Does the responsibility for Ukraine's construction rest with Moscow when taking into account the dismissal of the United States as well as NATO of Russia's security guarantees, the failure of the Minsk agreements, essentially all these that triggered the war in the first place?
Well, I mean, absolutely, as you say, I mean, the responsibility doesn't solely rely on Moscow, and as has been stated, I mean, what they're proposing to do, I mean, violates these slogans which the EU goes on about the respect of rule of law and such things as property rights. So if we go into it more, I mean, as you say, I mean, they're responsible for prolonging this war, and as numerous commentators have said, provoking the war. I mean, this is not one-sided, and I mean, in spite of all of their fine talk, their hands are far from being clean in this respect.
Right, so then, Harley, if the EU does use Russian funds for the reconstruction of Ukraine, doesn't that mean countries, for example, like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, and so on, have the right to use American funds for the construction of their countries following the wars that America waged against them?
Well, if there were justice in the world, and if the West was really committed, as they say, to sovereignty and democracy, then of course they'd reconstruct these countries. But they're not going to, because the Western war policy is built into a financial system which is collapsing. And what I would argue is that the effort to punish Russia by stealing the money, as they did with Afghanistan. Remember, they took $9 billion from Afghanistan. That by doing that, they're forcing countries to reconsider whether they want to remain in the dollar system. And we're seeing cracks in the dollar system all over the place. The Saudis now accepting the yuan for oil payments, Russian-Indian agreements, moves with the BRICS plus countries to look for a new financial system, new transaction system, new trade system. We're seeing a breakdown of the whole Western system. And what they don't realize is that by insisting on their right to take this money, they're sending messages to other countries, you can't trust the West. Now you add to that what you brought up before, the lies in Minsk, that Merkel and Hollande admitted they never intended to achieve a peace agreement. Why should any country in the global South trust one of the so-called advanced sector countries now? And this is part of the breakdown of the unipolar order that's enforced by NATO arms and especially US military.
Okay, and then Greg, just a similar question. What's your take on that? I mean, can countries that were invaded by NATO and as well as the United States, who saw their cities, entire cities carpet bombed and villages and towns and so on damaged, can they not request or ask the US, or do they not have the right to get funding from the United States to reconstruct their infrastructure?
Well, by violating their own system of international law, they open this up. I mean, look what happened with Kosovo when it was a so-called exception that broke the rule. And I mean, they have another moral dimension which they need to. I mean, there is the old joke. I mean, why are the pyramids in Egypt? Because they're too heavy for the British to carry away. I mean, you've got this attitude that they can just take everything because they have a strong military, a strong economy to do this, which they no longer do have. So, I mean, this is merely perpetuating, and I would say it will accelerate the decline of the West.
Right, and then Harley, final question to you. Do you see this measure by the EU or this proposal, this plan, do you see it as working out? Will it work out?
Well, I think they'll probably try to, but add to the tension among EU member states, because, for example, here in Germany, there's growing opposition to the war, growing opposition to sending tanks. The idea that the West can act in a completely ruthlessly unipolar way to impose its will on the world is not going to hold sway for long. And I think we're going to see they're going to try to do it. I don't think they're going to stop, but I don't think they're going to be successful. And the Russian offensive coming, there may be some blowback from Kiev, from the people of Ukraine who have had enough. So we'll see what happens. But I think the EU is deluded enough to think they have the power to force this through and the right to do it. And they don't, but they'll go ahead.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, let me thank you for your contribution. Harley Schlanger is the spokesman for the Le Rouge organization, joining us from Potsdam, Germany, and Greg Simons, researcher at the Institute for Russian and Eurasian Studies from Uppsala, Sweden. And that brings an end to another edition of the News Review. Anytime now.